right. We're going to be talking about AutoCon and NetDevOps Days coming together and the future of the network automation community.
It's absolutely right. And welcome to you that those are joining. We'll give a few more minutes for other folks to come on the call. I think I see 15, 16, 17 joining now. And for those of you who are already on, we will be using the Q&A box for you to submit questions. We will make sure we have time at the end to address any specific questions, but feel free to enter questions as we go through the discussion, and we'll address them as appropriate. And I'll repeat all that just before we get started.
First question for you, Scott.
Yes. Thank you, Mark Siri. I have an ongoing, let's call it, I look like I'm really mad, but it's just my serious face. I will do my best to smile and, show my recently whitened teeth. No, that's not true. But I appreciate the reminder.
It's the resting Scott face.
Right. That's, you got it. You got it. Yep. Thank you for that note on chat being disabled. All right, noted. Thank you very much. And let's use the Q&A for anything that you have to share. And if we need to share other information, other links, we'll find a way to do that. But thank you, Ender, for bringing that to our attention. All right, we're a couple minutes past the hour, so I'd like to get started. We've got 40 plus folks coming on. I'm sure there will be others coming on board, but let me give you a hearty welcome for this virtual panel on the integration of the NetDevOps Days coming into the AutoCon event series. We are so pleased that you could be with us here today. We'll be using the Zoom Q&A function here for your comments and questions. Let's do a quick introduction of all our panelists. I'll ask each of you to go through and just introduce yourself briefly. I'll use my screen order. Chris Wade, let's start with you.
Sure, Chris Wade, CTO at iTential. Thanks for joining.
And Andy?
Hi, I'm Andy Taylor. I'm a network specialist architect at AWS.
Very good. Chris Beavers?
Hey folks, Chris Beavers. I'm a co-founder CEO at NetBox Labs. Nice to see everybody.
Chris Grundeman?
Yeah, I am one of the co-founders along with Scott of the Network Automation Forum. And yeah, really excited for this conversation.
Same here. And I'm Scott Robon, again, co-founder with Chris of Network Automation Forum. I'll be acting as the moderator today, so I will be asking more questions than answering. But that's where we'll go with this today. So to start out, Chris Beavers, why don't you give us your short view and intro on NetDevOps Days history and your coming into the AutoCon series.
Yeah, thank you, Scott. First of all, thanks everyone for joining us on the panel here. And I see more folks continuing to flow in, which is awesome. Not a surprise because there's a ton of interest and a lot of groundswell in interest in network automation and just a lot of excitement and momentum, especially after last year. I mentioned, my name's Chris. I'm the co-founder and CEO at NetBox Labs. If you don't know NetBox Labs, straightforwardly, we're the commercial steward of open source NetBox, and our mission is to make it easier to build and operate complex networks. That's us, right? over the last couple of years, as we've been doing that, we've had a little bit of a realization, which is that most people who are using NetBox, they're somewhere on the arc of a network automation journey, right? NetBox is the source of truth in a lot of modern network automation architectures. So as we realized that, last year, and in line with that mission I mentioned, we decided it was really important for us to engage our community, engage our customers around that network automation journey to make sure that we're doing everything we can to help practitioners, operators share their best practices, to just accelerate this, dare I say, movement, right, around network automation all in. So, somewhere around mid-year last year, we at NetBox Labs, we went looking, right? Like, we wanted to find the right event that we should be at to have this conversation. There are a lot of events out there, as everyone knows, for networking practitioners generally. But it felt to us like automation was always a sidebar conversation at best, right? We didn't find any focused events zeroed in on this conversation about network automation. So sometime in May, and I bet he's on here probably, Mark Coleman, who's NetBox Labs co-founder, along with myself and Jeremy Stretch and a few others, we had this late night conversation, and we just said, this can't stand, right? Like, we decided to make an event, NetDevOps Days, it became, that was for, at least our community, the community that we had reach into, to focus this network automation conversation. And, if you know NetBox Labs, we like to do big things fast. So we did it, right? Like, we spun up a new event, we pulled in the community, we pulled in a bunch of incredible sponsors, thank you sponsors. And, we sold out our first NetDevOps Days event in London, I think twice, in about 30 days from concept to actual event. We had to move venues because there was so much demand, and it proved something to us, right? It proved that there really was a need for this community to come together and be able to have a focused conversation about network automation. And that event was incredible. I would say in some ways it was kind of cathartic, even for the folks who were there, to have an outlet with this laser focus on network automation. Now, of course, we were not the only ones who realized that an event like this needed to exist. At the same time, Scott and Chris were having their conversation, and I myself learned about the Network Automation Forum and AutoCon 0, I think maybe a month or two after that first NetDevOps Days event. And quite honestly, my reaction was we were thrilled. First, it was real validation to know that we at NetBox Labs, we were not the only ones who recognized the need for this community to come together and accelerate and have a place to engage around network automation. What we did end up doing, we went ahead with our second NetDevOps Days, which was in New York City, I think in the fall, and Scott was there. We had another great event. But at the same time, we really wanted to see AutoCon 0 succeed. And as everybody knows, it really did. For context, NetBox Labs, we're a product company. That is what we do, right? We build NetBox and we build NetBox Cloud, and our goal is to do that sustainably and scalably. What we are not is an event company. And what we learned definitely last year, and I know Scott and Chris have learned this too, is building and operating a really important event at the center of a community like this one is really hard, right? And it's not our core mission at NetBox Labs. So we knew it was going to get harder and harder for us to sustain that. And that's why as soon as we saw the success of AutoCon 0, I called Scott, right? And we started to figure out, how do we bring these communities together? My analogy is pretty simple. Like, we want to put the energy of NetBox Labs, the energy of the community that came together around NetDevOps Days behind the Network Automation Forum and AutoCon. We want to put all the wood behind that arrow. And the reason that we think that's important is we want to maximize the impact of the Network Automation Forum. We want to create the concentrated momentum that at least I believe needs to exist to really change the industry and accelerate network automation, call it like once and for all. So what was and has been great about NetDevOps Days, it was scrappy, it was very real. It's practitioners sharing learnings and helping each other push the network automation community forward. And my big hope for the Network Automation Forum and AutoCon is that that ethos and that community from NetDevOps Days adds even more energy and urgency to that mission. What I care about ultimately is, pardon my French, making shit happen, right? And specifically about making network automation happen. We're at the start of a wave. I think communities like this one really create momentum in industries and change them, and that's the opportunity we have here. So that's my spiel, a little bit of history and why I'm so excited, and really excited to talk about it a little more today. Thanks, Scott.
Very good. Chris Grundeman, why don't you give the complimentary NAF side of that set of events?
Yeah. I mean, I think Chris covered kind of the history of last year really well. Anybody who has studied the history of innovation and invention much has probably come across the idea that no one person or no one group ever invents anything. There's these ideas that kind of bubble up in the ethos. It's like it's the right time for things to happen, whether that's the theory of relativity or in a much humbler scale, a network automation conference. These things just kind of come into the zeitgeist at once, and I think definitely we didn't know that Chris and the team at NetBox Labs was developing this idea of NetDevOps Days. At the same time, Scott and I early in 2023 started talking about the idea of, does this make sense? Neither one of us had really put on a full scale, convention before. So, is this an insane idea at all? Would anybody show up? Does anybody want to sponsor it? We kind of talked through that a little bit. We connected with a few folks at a NANOG meeting in the middle of the year. Jeremy Schulman was one of them who really kind of helped push us forward and said, yes, this is needed. This is the time, like, go do this, please. And that gave us kind of the courage and confidence to move forward with that. And in July, we kind of officially founded the Network Automation Forum and created the idea of our first event, the AutoCon event. And I think it was literally a week or two after we had really decided to do this, I got an email from Chris saying, hey, we're doing NetDevOps Days in London. And I will say my heart sank a little bit. But I think everything worked out really, really good. Having 3 events last year to energize and bring this community together and rally around was excellent. And I'm really excited about combining those forces and pushing this forward in 2024, where we've got kind of a unified community behind the AutoCon event series, where we'll have 2 more this year, two more of the big AutoCon events. And we're already talking about, which I think we'll probably get into a little bit here, maybe some smaller events and other things we can do to help kind of move network automation forward. Because I think that having this, vendor neutral watering hole for folks to come and talk about these things as they're being invented, right? Network automation has been talked about for a while, but it's really, as Chris said, that wave is kind of just starting to kind of come up out of the ocean, and you can see it from the beach now, because these things are really, really starting to happen now, and hopefully we can help you surf it.
No, very good. Well, we've already essentially started our panel discussion, but now we're going to formally move into some of the panel topics and questions that we've collaborated on. And let me just remind all the attendees, please don't hesitate to put your questions into the Q&A window. This will be much more interesting to respond to things that you bring to the discussion and not just listen to ourselves talk, because we do that quite a bit. But let me start with for Chris G and Chris B. We're all seeing this groundswell and activity around network automation, interest in network automation. We obviously both, were involved in our event series, and now bringing this into one stream together. What's behind it? What's happening in the market that's creating all this industry? And I'll go to Chris G first, and then Chris B, you can follow up. And by the way, other panelists, this is not exclusive, chime in with your thoughts.
Yeah. So kind of like, I guess the question is really, why is this the right time for this network automation conversation to really be overflowing? And, it's definitely something that's been a long time coming. I think in some ways it's overdue. I saw a little bit of this spark of excitement really come around like 2012 with OpenFlow and this idea of SDN and this promise that we could have these software-defined networks and go in and maybe even invent protocols on the fly and push them out to switches with this API and interface, and people got really excited about it. SDN has kind of been defined as the separation of the control plane from the data plane. I think what excited people about SDN though was network automation. It was the idea that I could not have to log into every single box and manually change, the VLAN or add MPLS or, whatever those things are that I'm going around and doing. And I could actually kind of orchestrate this from further back and a little bit higher level thinking of looking at the network as a system instead of a series of boxes. Now, I got really excited about that at the time. I think a lot of people got really excited about that at the time. it didn't necessarily catch on. I think the way we do networking is fairly ingrained at this point. And so if anything, I'd say we're, a little late. But this is the time, I think, where, as Chris said earlier, that wave is starting to kind of crest a little bit. And people are catching on that this is a new way of doing things. Now, why that is, I don't know. I could speculate a little bit. I think definitely the cloud itself, right? The outsourcing of infrastructure to other parties and providing these kind of interfaces where I don't necessarily know the ins and outs of networking, but I have to use it to pull these things together, I think is part of it. And people kind of want that same simplicity in their own on-premises networks as well, right? Or to connect the clouds together and connect the clouds with the on-premises, right? The hybrid cloud, the multi-cloud, all this stuff, I think, is driving some of this. It made it really necessary because you can't just do it the old way anymore. If you're doing this multi-cloud estate, you really just, there's no option to log in on the CLI of every device, because many of these devices now you don't even own, but you still need to send them instructions and be able to understand what's going on there and move them and stuff. So that's a big part of it, I think. And I lost my thread, so I'll leave it there for now.
Well, I might pick up where you left off there, Chris, and just go a little deeper. I think for folks who are not aware, NetBox Labs spun out of NS1, where we were sort of lucky to be engaged with these networking teams over about a decade. And what drove our conviction that the time has come for network automation was engaging with our customers who are trying to solve problems in their networks. And what we observed was networks for every company in the world, and all of us as humans, are increasingly pretty critical, right? Like, our lives are online, everything that we do is online. The pandemic, I think, was a driver of this. As Chris said, the adoption of public cloud or DevOps methodologies has driven criticality of connected services and systems, and complexity is the other thing that it's driven, right? Like, what is behind these networks and what is happening on these networks is critical, and it's complicated, and it's super dynamic, right? Like, the needs and the workloads on a network are changing on a minute-to-minute basis now, not like a year-to-year basis, right? And so these are an important petri dish of conditions we've seen in other contexts before. Like, I think probably all of our panelists here, were around and in industry back when, what we now call DevOps was emerging. On the systems and application side, right? At the time, infrastructure as code, and this basic idea that, the importance of applications was growing, and the complexity of applications was growing, and the rate of change in application infrastructure was super high and needed automation, right? Like, those are the petri dish of conditions that we're dealing with here. And at the same time, and I, probably preaching to the choir for folks who are on this Zoom right now, networking teams are being asked to do more with less, right? My favorite data point in the last couple of years is from our friend Seamus McGillicuddy at EMA Research, the analyst firm, and he does this longitudinal study every couple of years, and he pings enterprise networking teams, and he says, "How successful are you feeling?" And on a percentage basis, 5 or 6 years ago, about 70% of enterprise networking teams were like, "We got this." Last year it was like 23%, right? That's the trend, because they're being asked to do more with less in more critical, complex, and dynamic conditions, right? So that is why this is so important right now.
So along those lines, there's a good, very specific question that's come in from Chris Russell. Chris asks, does the panel think there are similarities here between network automation and what happened in the early aughts in terms of LAMP control panels for DNS, for mail, for radius, et cetera? Maybe I'll put Andy and Chris Wade on the spot a little bit. Do you see those dots connecting here based on the question? 20 years ago, it's hard. It's a long way back to try and remember. I know.
I'm trying to remember what I had for breakfast. I don't know his honest answer, but I do think it's slightly tangential. Is back in the day, I think you had to have a skill set in programming, in scripting, to be able to take on some of those tasks. And, knowledge was not easy to get. You had to, potentially either have a computer science degree, or you had to persuade your employer to go and get an 1 week course. But I think now what's also changed is access to quality knowledge is become a lot easier. So I think I can speak for myself, what certainly scares a lot of network engineers is, we've been using command lines for a while. And then when you ask to kind of do something, then you presented a JSON file, or you asked to do something in Python, it's like, what? I don't know this stuff. But in the past, it was quite, you'd have to find a good book, and there weren't like millions of them, or try and get on a course. But this really good quality information where you can now pick up enough basics to also spin up something virtually, on a small laptop and get going. And we never had that luxury then. It just wasn't available. So I think it's easier to get involved now if you've got the desire to do so.
Yeah, so Scott, the answer to the question is yes. But the nuance here is, what Chris Gruneman said at the beginning resonates with me in the sense that, from an intentional perspective, participating in OpenFlow and ODL in the early days, the interesting part for us was really the ability to program the network, and the fact that this programmability was going to be exposed. But what happened over the last 5 or 6 years is a certain level of chaos in the networking world, right? Tons of startups, tons of strategies, tons of how is it going to manifest itself from virtual, vCPE to SD-WAN, cloud networking, et cetera. And, at the end of the day, the maturation of those concepts over the last 10 years is really, and you see it with super macro market conditions like HPE buying Juniper. You're seeing kind of consolidation and maturity in the space, which really allows us to think about how do we operate networks differently, right? So if you're in the automation game and you go from, different concepts of NetConf and controllers and cloud networking, you're constantly kind of putting the foundations in place. And if we can get some level of stability and maturity within the networking domain and the greater infrastructure domain, it allows us to kind of build more substantial concepts on top of this. And I think one of the things from AutoCon 0 was the separation of automation and orchestration. And if you're constantly rebuilding your automation layer, it's hard to build up to the stack to build the value to our end customers. And I think, from a pure market perspective, the overall maturity of these awesome concepts that we've been kicking around for the last 10 years, we usually give some of our equipment providers a hard time, but the maturity of that over the last 10 years really allows us to rethink how we build operating models on top of this infrastructure. And that's the most exciting part for us.
Chris Wade, let's stick with you on this a little bit. You have the unique position on this panel of being, I think, the only individual who's presented at NetDevOps Days, both events, and AutoCon 0. What were your observations with the two event series? What would you like to see continue in the combined work stream?
Yeah, I would say it's been hard to find the watering hole, as Chris said earlier, the hangout place. These communities are attached to a lot of different communities, so anytime there's a group of people saying, let's go automate some stuff, you have our full support. So we're running around all over the world trying to, whatever sort of pockets have popped up, we're there to support in any way, shape, or form. So yeah, hopping a plane and getting into all these meetings was obvious from the start. So I appreciate everybody that put those events together. I know it goes without saying how much effort goes behind that. But anyways, to answer your question, I will say that this is considered a fairly niche industry. And the biggest observation is the diversity of strategies, the diversity of maturity. I would just say diversity if I had to pick one thing. So you listen to all these presentations, you have infrastructure as code, we have platform engineering, we have getting started, training, education. And I think to the whole group, including everybody attending or listening to this on replay, it's really like, what are we going to do with this? In the sense that we have such a diverse group of people and we have to figure out how we can work together. So, just going to all these events, I would say that we've started with the most excited of the population. If you heard AutoCon 0 or you got an email on on a Slack group thread, you ran and got there. As we talk about growing the community and we talk about that, I think we really need to think about the population that was kind of the first in the door, and then the possibilities and what diversity exists and how we can help everybody at their point in the journey. Yeah, great events. But if you looked at just the topics, I mean, just reading the topics and authors and presenters, the diversity is definitely my takeaway.
Cool. Let me work in another question from the audience. And Andy, I'm going to ask you to take this first. I think, given some of the conversation we've had and where you come from and what you're doing now, this could be interesting for you. What creates the catalyst for automation at most places, given it requires a lot of heavy lifting to move the ball forward? That's from Mark Siri asking that question. Andy, take a crack at it, but others chime in as well.
I think that's a great question. So I think doing more interesting things. I think, look, we're familiar with day-to-day, especially from a network perspective, the tasks that need to be doing, the configs that we need to put in. We know the subject matter well, but we spend too much time, or we used to spend too much time doing repetitive, error-prone, often quite mundane tasks that had to be done. And I think we're still in a large degree at everyone else can make changes throughout the day, except networks, which is 2 o'clock on a Saturday morning. And then no one wants to do that anymore. But it's at risk, right? If the network goes, then everything goes down. And we don't typically have the data to prove that we can do this without causing a problem. So when you see someone that's done something that's quite, can be pretty meaningless at start, and they've written a script to do it, and it's done some really cool stuff and bringing a report back that would have taken you hours, you think, hang on a minute, I want to do that too. And then after that, as I said before, I think access to information now is a lot easier. So you can get started. What's kind of happening here really is now trying to build that community to get further support, to work out where you can go next, or what opportunities exist to just have a conversation with someone who's in the same boat as you, or maybe been doing it a bit longer. And then, that empowers you then to say, well, I want to try something now. And then other people get excited by that. And then that's really, from a catalyst perspective, it gets the ball rolling. And before you know it, I wouldn't say everybody, because I think some people really want to do the way that they like to do the way they do things. But with the majority of people, they start getting pretty excited. They can put their energy now towards engineering and architecture and come away from a majority of the ops type tasks that take up far too much of everyone's day.
I might add just quickly here, something very simple. Podcast, I often am interviewing, folks about how they started in their network automation journey. And so, the thing that we hear almost invariably is small, right? I or we or the team or whatever picked off some small, annoying, task that we know is automatable. And the other thing that we often hear, unfortunately, is, and then we did it in our spare time, nights and weekends, right? Because there isn't executive level support for automation, from the top down in the organization. And that is the pattern today. That's not the pattern that we want to persist. I think one of the real opportunities of a community like this is, first of all, bringing practitioners together to even have this conversation about how did you get started, right? It's the most common question I found at NetDevOps Days, or probably at AutoCon 0, and certainly in the community. How did you get started? And then the second most common question I typically run into anyway is like, how did you get support from the decision makers? How did you get budget to get started with network automation, all that kind of stuff? And I think one of the things that's really important for us as a community this year and next year and so on is to start to articulate in ways that are accessible by decision makers, by executives in these organizations. Like, why is network automation important? How do you enable your team to get started on network automation? Because I'm 100% sure everyone who's here listening right now or is going to watch this afterward is here because they want to be progressing in their automation journeys. But often, there isn't that sense of enablement, or like, this is something that is part of my job, or I can take on.
Yeah, there's another piece here, I think, or maybe adding on to that, Chris, is I've done some work in pre-sales, and one of the things I learned early on was that, if you want somebody to buy something, which I think in this case, what we're talking about is the team selling network automation to management potentially to get that funding to be able to do it, not in their spare time, but in their, in the course of their job. You've really got to save the business money, make the business money, or reduce risk, right? I mean, really, I think a lot of enterprise spending, and even on the service provider side, comes down to one of those three buckets. And so a big thing that I've found can be a catalyst is in the idea that you're making the network more secure and more stable, right? I mean, we've talked about this additional complexity. Pretty much anybody who's worked on a network, I think, probably has the same experience, which is that, if you're the second person to come in, or the third person or the fourth person, there is things that are done in a different way than you would have done it, and it's not standardized, right? And so then you can make mistakes because you might miss something that somebody else did a slightly different way than the way you would have done it. Or even over time, right? If you work on the same network for 5 years, you probably are now doing things differently than you did before. So even if you were the only person who ever touched the network, if you're doing it all manually, eventually you're going to come down and say, on one interface, you've got all the VLANs listed out explicitly. And on another interface, you've got them in a group, or you've got them in a, some kind of list, or you've got them, concatenated in some way. And you miss that there's a missing VLAN on an interface, and you've got this problem that you just can't track down. And one of the things that is a precursor to automation, and therefore is one of the big gains of automation and like the earliest stages, in my opinion, is just standardization, right? If you're doing things in an automatic way, if you're using tooling to push these changes out, then the changes and the configs are always the same. And it becomes much easier to understand what's going on and to ensure that everything works the way you expect it to work. Which is why this kind of, these ideas of golden configs and sources of truth and all this stuff really matters. But a lot of it comes down to just like looking across the network and making sure that it's standardized, because you have to have it standardized in order to automate it well. And by automating it, you keep it standardized. And that alone can really reduce the amount of errors you have on your network and the amount of outages you have and all this stuff. I think, well, for one thing, 82% of statistics are made up on the spot, but I do believe that it was something like 70% of network outages in a study I saw were caused by human error, right? If you look at the big service providers, they have these, change freezes around the holidays. So in a lot of places, a lot of networks shut down and they don't let anybody touch the network for any reason from, like November through December, because people make mistakes and people break stuff. And automation can reduce that a lot. So I think that's an entry point where it is an uphill battle and it is a push. But if you sell it in the context of the fact of what it can save you, I think that matters a lot, because I also do some consulting and stuff on these things, and usually the catalyst is either a networking team quits or gets fired, and or there's a huge explosion in the network, and that's when people realize, oh crap, like we need to do this a different way. So hopefully you can realize that, get your company to realize that, or your organization, slightly before it's an actual emergency.
I think the cool thing with what you've just said also is with the golden configs is a lot of people, obviously for obvious reasons, when they're dipping their toes into kind of first getting involved in this, you don't necessarily want to change a kind of a B2 access list or something, because then we've all blocked ourselves out before. You've got the ability to mass look at configuration and just do auditing and reporting, right? You can generate a lot of data and discover a lot of things that people are just never aware of, that deviate from this golden config for read-only mode. And then you can start small, right? We'll start really small and build it up and build it up. And before you know it, you've got tens, hundreds, thousands of devices now that kind of are compliant just based on small incremental changes that started with zero risk, because you've had read-only and you've just pulled in information. And I think as you start doing more of this, it gives you more confidence, but it also gives the senior management more visibility of just what can be done with automation. Because if you were to say to someone, will you go and audit our network, all devices, Matt, that's going to take forever. And no one wants to do that. That's a big job. But and there's also something I have to admit, which is quite satisfying, of taking something of that magnitude, developing a script or a playbook or whatever tooling you're using, and bringing back this big report, thousands of devices, and look at all the small differences. I did that. That's really cool. And the zero is doing that because it's read only.
Well, so there's another interesting question from the attendees that I think can layer in here. And I'll leave this open for whoever wants to tackle. I think we're going to have some diversity of opinion on it. Jesus asks, when do you consider to use a vendor solution for network automation versus building in-house? Where does it make sense to go with the vendor, and versus when to start developing your own solution? Don't be shy.
I can kick that one off. I think, in general, I think if the vendor solution fits your need and you can afford it, do that, because building your own tools and maintaining them over time is a way more work than most people realize it is, right? And so I think in general, that's my theory is, like, don't reinvent the wheel. If there's something out there that I can use that, and focus on the glue and the configuration and then the policy and all the other things, right? I think, the market's maturing, so there may not be a tool for every use case you have, and that's where you got to build your own. But if it's out there and you can afford it, there's not many cases where that's not the right choice, in my opinion.
I'm just going to add one small thing on this, and this might open a can of worms. So let's just see. There's a difference between automation of going in and doing a task, right? Because if you're deploying something, and let's just say you're using your favorite framework, and it's a vendor or it's something you've written yourself, and it does a task. What exactly has happened is it's done exactly what you've told it to do. That's it. Right, but how do you know that's what the intended outcome you expected? So, we've got to start looking at this at a slightly bigger scale as well, of saying, I want to make sure that I will make a change and I get the expected outcome. And then I've got some mechanism then to pass it on to the next thing down the line. So it means that you're not necessarily tied into one vendor, one tool. As long as there's a mechanism for those tools, because, there's not always one tool that suits every use case. As long as there's a mechanism for this pipeline to say, look, I've done my job and I validated it's what you wanted it to do, I'm going to pass it on to the next one. Now, it could be a complete different framework. It just takes an input, does the job you asked it to do, validates that it's good, and then passes it on. And not only is it a way to make sure you haven't got, you've got to get this holy grail of frameworks that does everything for you, but also different teams and different parts of the business might have different requirements, but you can all feed into this common framework that does a specific task and passes it on to the next job to do. So I guess that's my answer. You don't need one versus the other. It could be heterogeneous as long as you've got a mechanism that ties them all together in a way that achieves the result, not just on positive, but if it fails, everything fails back.
Yeah, so I discuss this a lot. And I will say the act of automating is the most important thing to do. So when we say build it ourselves, the awesome thing today versus a couple years ago is we have so many frameworks to pick from. So when we say build it ourselves, we're standing on top of the shoulders of people that have built all sorts of awesome tooling that's available, right? So people, it's very difficult to understand what attributes and functionality you need from a software that you're going to purchase until you've done the active automation, right? You're doing, you can't buy it off of PowerPoints and demos. You have to do the active automating. And I think the best thing to do is to automate, and then you understand what are the actual most critical features and concepts for your organization and the challenges that you're achieving. And I will say something else that I feel passionate about is that, there are automation domains, and automating different components, cloud, firewall, data centers is quite different. And that's why a lot of these debates happen. People are passionate on both sides, but I would just come back to the fact that when we build it ourselves, we're still leveraging a ton of investment and time, energy that people have put into these frameworks. And any active automation should be well supported within the organization. So I'll leave it there.
Thanks, Chris. I just want to add maybe one or two other quick things here that maybe bring together a few of the elements that you guys have discussed. What Andy was talking about that I think is super important is the notion that there's no one size fits all mega network automation tool, right? Like any organization has unique characteristics, unique requirements, and what's really important and what is emerging, I think, is the notion of a composable ecosystem of tools, whether they're vendor tools or open source tools or build it yourself tools or whatever, that go together to implement a working architecture, right? There's no right answer. You don't just buy the whole thing. There is no such thing that you can go purchase, right? And then, there are elements of those architectures that work that do have vendor options, do have, build it yourself or open source or whatever options. The way I think about vendors is, at least product vendors, is they're investing for scale. And what I don't mean by scale is like technical scale. I mean by that ecosystem scale. Like what I care about at NetBox Labs anyway is we're trying to change industries, right? And you don't do that in a bespoke way, in an environment by environment way. You do that by figuring out like what are the commonalities, at least in this particular component of the reference architecture for network automation, right? And how do we deepen the value in those commonalities, and then how do we make it easy for everybody to adopt that and scale it? And your environment may not map to those commonalities or that scaled product vision. But any vendor that survives anyway is investing in ways that map to most of the needs for like that particular piece of technology in the automation stack. So, I really think you need both, right? Like you need vendor solutions that can scale and make it easier for teams to, roll forward. In this case, with network automation, in other cases with other problems they're solving. And you need the ability for teams to, build in their own way for uniquenesses in their environment or adapt, open source tools or whatever works.
I want to selfishly take off my moderator hat and insert myself in the panelist stream here. On this particular set of conversations, I think, as Chris Gruneman and I have talked about this and batted around the roll your own solutions versus, vendor and tech supplier solutions, we really want to encourage radical collaboration amongst all parties here, right? The vendors and technology suppliers bring important innovation, productized, that we can use, to the table. There are all sorts of people that are doing their own scripting, doing their own integrations between tools that have important things to bring to the table. There's a pro services community that helps, glue these things together. And I won't limit it to a three-legged stool, right? There are other parties here where these kind of conversations, and I'll keep saying radical collaboration, is really, we want this to be part of NAF DNA, right? This is an essential feature, definitely not a bug of what we're trying to do with NAF.
Scott, I'm just going to say one thing. I think anytime that you build a safe, vibrant community, good things are going to happen. Right? You can build a phenomenal product, or you can build like a one-off something amazing, but without that supporting foundation of this kind of vibrant community that is collaborative, things peter out. I think one of the problems that we've got today to a degree is, I want to get started, I want to do something, who do I ask? Who can help me? And it's sometimes difficult to be the one to put your hand up and say, look, I'm lost, but can you help? And I think the stronger and more collaborative the community, the easier that becomes. And that just lifts everybody up.
Agreed. Let me layer in another participant question here. Again, that I think is a good follow on here. Andy, you already addressed this, but I want to bring more attention to it. Gabrielle asked, there's quite some automation work done by the community on deployment and maintenance of the network. What do you see happening in other aspects that are essential to networking that are not so much in the spotlight? Monitoring, incident response, assurance of automation, and more. And I will pick on Chris Beavers and Chris Wade. I think you probably both see lots of use cases come across your plate. Not limiting it to you two, but what are you seeing automation being applied that's not getting as much attention as you think it should?
Well, actually, I want to maybe even more tactically address this question. What's come out in Gabriel's question, which I really love, that connects to what we were just talking about, is a bunch of different problem domains that all map back to creating a working network automation architecture, right? Like there's the automation tools themselves, there's the source of truth, there's the monitoring and incident response, and call it like generally like observability ecosystem around it. And I agree with what Andy said, for those who can read in the chat, that like these are critical aspects of any network. But we talked a few minutes ago about this notion of composability of tools, whether they're vendor tools or open source tools or built-yourself tools that make up a working architecture. And one of the reasons that's so important is, network monitoring or incident response and incident management, or network discovery or assurance tools. These are vibrant ecosystems on their own, right? And in some cases, in areas that don't directly come from this problem of network management and network automation, right? Like monitoring and incident response and observability generally is a whole industry to itself, right? And what we can do when we think in terms of architectures, working architectures, and composability of those architectures is hook into what's come before in other industries, right? Like I bet you most operators who are on this call use in some way Grafana as an example, or Prometheus, or tools like that are super deep in observability and add all kinds of capability. And we get to, I think Chris Wade said this earlier, like we get to stand on the shoulders of what has come before, in some cases, not even in our industry, right? Like we get to adapt ideas and tools from elsewhere that is going to help us, accelerate down the automation path.
Yeah, I think what this picks at is kind of our traditional way of operating networks, in the sense that, it's come up a couple times today, but kind of like my job, my team's job, and my company is strategy. In the sense that, assurance and incident resolution was typically a different department that talked to the same device. And if I ask the folks on the line, like, how many different tools talk to a single router or switch in your environment? Like, how many things? They'd be like, 12 things. This pulls it, this pings it, this collects alarms, this does observability. So, as we look at automation in its broadest concept, we're talking about how do we change this? And I think the macro trend here is we're going from tools to platforms. And you used a tool to do a job, and 12 tools would talk to that same switch to do 12 different jobs. But as we connect these things, as people drive efficiency, kind of day two operations, as I saw it earlier in the question from Mark, service provisioning, application-driven networking, like all these higher level concepts, is how do these things come together? And if you step back and squint your eyes a little bit, this is, I think, core fundamental to NAF, is how do we bring these different constituents together? How do we build reference architectures? And I do think there is a sense that there is a sense of existing tools that were built for a bygone era. And I think part of our challenge is how do we migrate that stuff? So, as Chris started with the SDN concepts, we have programmable infrastructure now, and we had an entire industry built about non-programmable infrastructure with spreadsheets and offline databases. And really, when you merge all this together, it's really how do we automate at scale to solve all these challenges? And ultimately, we want teams to work together so we can do this at scale, as been discussed. So I think we have some tactical opportunities, and then we have some definitely strategic opportunities as we think how we connect these teams.
I'm just going to add one really small thing to that. I mean, some of the things that were mentioned there, especially around monitoring and assurance, these are a low risk from an automation perspective, some of them, because you can start these things without having to have done loads of things and really be confident about the feedback loops you're doing. These are kind of jobs that are critical, and you can start with the minimum amount of knowledge, because even if you're just pulling, let's just say, I'm thinking of an example I had, you're pulling off NTP servers that are available to the internet, a little thing, right? Or making sure your V2 access lists are all good. And if that's a read-only thing that you can go off and do across thousands of devices and pull that back, that could potentially save a security incident or something else. And it's a great way to start. So, I think just think about it that way. Some of these things might not be the things that like the whole world's looking at, but they're really important jobs. You build confidence in your ability, you learn something new, and it's low risk. It's a win-win-win situation.
Yeah, I agree with everything that's been said, and I want to just kind of highlight it or underline it a little bit. But I think for one thing, I would go so far as to state that full cycle automation needs to be the goal. You have to just not just be throwing changes out into the network, but you have to be validating that they actually stick and that they did what you thought they were going to do. Beyond that, I really agree with Andy that one of the best places to start is read-only automation, right? Again, I use VLANs a lot for an example, but if you're trying to troubleshoot an issue and you know that you normally follow these steps, right? Maybe you have to go switch by switch down the line to see if that VLAN's on every interface. You can write a script to do that and to do that for you, and you can kind of build a toolbox of scripts that can go out and do some of these common troubleshooting tasks. That's a really good way to kind of get familiar with it and get your organization interested in the enhancements that can be made by using some programmability. And I would take it even further and say that kind of at the other end of the spectrum, once you've gotten deep into automation, you really want to be doing a lot of your troubleshooting through the automation tools, right? I think that whatever the system it is that you pull together, whether it's from open source projects or commercial projects, and you pull it all together, you've got this full automation system now. Part of that system has to be being able to figure out where problems are and why, and tracking that stuff down. There's a cool open source tool out there, SuzyQ, which does some really neat kind of time series database of state, which is interesting. There's also other tools out there that do like packet captures and stuff to see what's going on in the network. But having that visibility and doing that instead of box by box, but also from this kind of system-wide view, I think has to be part of the network automation journey, for sure.
Yeah,
just also 2024, and I think it's the obligatory. You've got to mention AI somewhere. And I think with one of these things where with a local LLM, so you're not giving your public data off to the rest of the world. We get so much telemetry back from the network, be it Syslog, SNMP, or whatever polling systems we've got. Automation can also be, taking this data from, say, Syslog and just passing it to an LLM model just to say, is there anything that's anomalous in this batch? Is there anything anomalous in this batch? Something that you as a human would really struggle to spot given the vast amount of data coming through. And if there is, act on it. Send off a pre-populated ticket saying this is anomalous because of this, and the ticket arrives in the queue, and it's got all the it's got a whole bunch of information for people to do. And as Chris G said, we normally got steps A, B, C, and D, and now the engineers already got the answers to A, B, C, and just needs D. Given you having to do very little, it's a huge time saver, and it could be very preventative from a big problem.
So much more we could talk about on this topic alone. Per Chris Gruneman's point, end-to-end closed loop. We do this in so many other areas, in avionics, other mechanical systems. We need to figure out a way to get the human out of the click OK to continue loop, right? I think I'm a big fan of starting with the end in mind, right? And I know that can be intimidating and maybe too big of a bite to chew off. But as we work on these incremental steps forward with automating tasks, automating fleets, and then orchestrating automation activities together, and even zooming out to, okay, we can't view all these disciplines on the network in silos, and we can't view the network apart from what's happening on the compute side, on the storage side, and ultimately for application and service delivery that actually meets a business goal. All those dots have to be connected, but we're not going to solve that today on this call. We've got about 5 minutes left. Thank you, participants, for so many great questions, and panelists I think you all really knocked it out of the park. What a great conversation. Let's take 5 minutes here and just kind of give you the view of what's happening going forward now for the rest of 24. Chris Gruneman and I, let's kind of take this in pieces. Some of you have asked, what are our plans? Well, Chris, go ahead. What are our plans for the next big events in 24?
Yeah. So I guess the big things is obviously the AutoCon event series itself is continuing now with the weight of kind of the NetDevOps Days community behind it. AutoCon 1, which is actually our second event, will happen in Europe in May. It's going to be the week of May 27th, which is the U.S. Memorial Day Monday. But hopefully that's less relevant for the Europeans. And it is going to be focused on kind of that European crowd. But so yeah, the week of 27th May will be AutoCon 1. The call for papers is open, and we're doing kind of a rolling call for papers this year. So feel free to put stuff in, even if you want to do something at AutoCon 2, which will be the week of November 18th back in the United States. So those are the two big events, one in May, one in November. They're both listed on the website if you didn't jot down those dates quick enough. And we'll have firm dates and locations soon. Obviously, AutoCon 1 sooner than AutoCon 2. We'll have that locked down. And then there's lots of other things we're talking about. So some of these things are TBD. Within the Network Automation Forum Slack, we've got a few kind of birds of a feather and different documentation working groups that are nascent, but starting out. We're looking at things like putting together a glossary of terms and trying to come to kind of a fairly defined standard of, again, as Chris Wade pointed out earlier, this the differentiation between automation and orchestration. How do we actually define that? And what do all these other terms mean and how they relate to each other? So we're putting together kind of a lexicon or a glossary. We're also looking at frameworks. I think that having these vendor neutral, looking at the big picture of like, how does this architecture work, and then we can start to talk about where the different tools and pieces fit in, because as everyone said and agreed pretty wholeheartedly, there is no one thing. An automated network is not a thing you can go buy off the shelf to fit your needs. And so you're going to have to figure out, what does the architecture look like? Where do the pieces go? And then what parts do I need to fill in because they differentiate my network or my company, my organization from others. Other things are much more TBD, I guess. We've talked about a podcast, maybe some more of these webinars. We've also talked about smaller local events. I think we were all fairly inspired by John Willis's keynote opening up AutoCon 0 in Denver in November. And he talked about the fact that one of the reasons that DevOps was able to take off so well is that they provided a recipe for DevOps Days that anyone could just pick up and do a local event. And so we're exploring that idea. I don't know what it looks like yet, but we're having those conversations and thinking about that. So I think that's the highlight reel. There may be lots more to come. So definitely stay tuned. You can jump on the mailing list on the website or in the Slack channel and be the first to know when these things become more solid and more concrete.
And just on the concept of the smaller gatherings for locally driven network automation activities, that's actually come from some of you. We just got an interesting ask this week to do one of these local type meetups in Europe. I don't want to spill any beans yet, as it's still the center of the cookie is still soft and chewy. It is not fully baked yet. But in addition to keeping on top of the website, joining our Slack channel, we have a lot of activity on LinkedIn. Please, keep up with us there. We're trying not to create an overabundance of channels, but we want to be transparent and make sure that what's going on with NAF. We will be pushing out details for Amsterdam as soon as they're locked in, and we are working very rapidly toward that right now. So 2 minutes left. Any other closing comments from Andy, from Chris Beavers, from Chris Wade? Keep it short because we only have 2 minutes.
We've got to build this community. So don't sit back. It'll all happen. You need to be the change that you want to see.
Just add basically the same. There's momentum here now, right? Like that's what happened last year. Is a ton of momentum got built. Bringing these two events together deepens the momentum behind AutoCon and the Network Automation Forum. Let's lean into it.
And I would say the events are when we all come together and share what we've been working on between the events. The meet happens in between. So, challenge everybody we have to figure out what we're going to do in between so that we can put NAF behind the events.
And that's going to depend on community involvement, right? This won't work if there isn't strong community from grassroots up leadership. Chris and I know that we need to put some more framework and structure around that, and not just throw very vague requests at you all. But we're talking about that pretty regularly. Let me, with that, bring this to a close. For all of you that are able to join, thank you so much. Great questions from so many of you. And panelists, extremely well done. Thanks for the collaboration, not just on this call, but for everything that's going on with NAF. Very, very excited about continuing this in 2024. With that, thank you very much. Have a great rest of your day.
Thanks, Scott. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks all.